Okay. So, this is kind of funny. Here we have Horvath introducing Ahlquist, who's introducing Chesterton, who introduced Dickens. You can follow that chain. It's a funny statement, and we know it's wrong, and that's why it's particularly good. Is that it said that Dickens gave us Christmas, and we all kind of chuckle at, well, Dickens didn't give us Christmas. Yet, he did. And it's an interesting point. Father Hetzler and I have discussed it from time to time. In Dickens' day, the feast of Christmas and the real Christian joy of Christmas in England was very much disparaged by the Puritan element. And Dickens felt that the real people, the real England, that people still loved Christmas and wrote the Christmas Carol in that spirit, and in a very real sense did bring Christmas back. I often wonder, every year you see the Christmas Carol and you see all these awful, horrendous versions of it. And yet, no matter what they try to do to the Christmas Carol, it's still actually a beautiful story. The writer Peter Ackroyd, wrote a marvelous book on Dickens, probably about 15, 20 years ago. And he makes several complimentary remarks on Chesterton, and says that Chesterton is probably the critic who best understands Dickens. But in his remarks on the Christmas Carol, this is just an interesting aside. He said that the character, he calls it a modern fairy tale story, and Ackroyd says so it has remained. He says that Dickens associated himself most closely with a particular character. And you got to know who Dickens was. He was preoccupied with money. He had to be. He was responsible for his own family, a large group of children. His parents, his father, would run the family bankrupt, and was one of the reasons why Dickens had many of the unpleasant experiences he did as a child, and siblings, etc. So Dickens supported a lot of people, but he was also very interested in money, preoccupied with profit. But he saw in the Christmas Carol the one character that really Dickens most closely identified wasn't Bob Cratchit or any of the innocent, great, wonderful characters in the story. It's Scrooge himself. It's just a very interesting insight that Ackroyd has. I'm a lover of Dickens. And we owe, those of us who do love Dickens, actually owe Chesterton a great debt. It's not widely known, but as Dale will point out, I'm sure, he kind of rescued Dickens from the ash heap, and that's in the same way, somewhat silly analogy, but in the same way that Dickens gave us Christmas, Chesterton gave us Dickens. But I found one wonderful passage in Chesterton. It was a book from the Victorian age in literature, and it's probably something Dale's going to quote, so I'm going to read it now. And he'll have to dash around and think fast, and I like to put Dale on the spot. The art of Dickens was the most exquisite of arts. It was the art of enjoying everybody. Dickens, being a very human writer, had to be a very human being. He had his faults and sensibilities in a strong degree. And I do not for a moment maintain that he enjoyed everybody in his daily life, but he enjoyed everybody in his books. And everybody has enjoyed everybody in those books, even till today. His books are full of baffled villains stalking out, or cowardly bullies kicked downstairs. But the villains and the cowards are such delightful people that the reader always hopes the villain will put his head through a side window and make a last remark, or that the bully will say one thing more, even from the bottom of the stairs. The reader really hopes this, and he cannot get rid of the fancy that the author hopes so too. Just, I don't know, that's just typical of some of Chesterton's great writing and great literary appreciation. You all know Dale Ahlquist by now. He really doesn't need an introduction, and for me, he actually doesn't get one. The head of the American Chesterton Society, and really hardworking in the cause, and really the reason why America knows about Chesterton today is largely through Dale's efforts. And it's a pleasure to bring Dale up to the microphone and have him talk about two writers that I love. Dale.
Thank you, Lou, Gene. Thanks for putting this conference on for 10 years. It really is something I look forward to coming to every year. It's just a really blessed time and great joy, which is exactly what Charles Dickens is about, which is a lovely pairing here. I also want to thank the folks who come from all around the country to this conference, and from our other Chesterton societies. We've got the Western Pennsylvania Chesterton Society here, which is run by Vicki Darkey, who is the liaison for all the local Chesterton societies around the country. And then we've got what? We've got the Buffalo Chesterton Society. There's Buffalo there. All right. Albany Chesterton Society is here. Where are you, Albany? There you are. Great. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. All right. And there's another one here. Oh yes, Warren, Ohio. Ellen Dickens back. I have the great privilege tomorrow going over to Syracuse and giving a talk where they're trying to get a Chesterton Society started there in Syracuse. And I'll be visiting Long Island and the big monster itself this week. So say a prayer for me that I live. When we read Chesterton, we recognize immediately that he's speaking the truth. It's just one of those things for all of us who've read him, just know that experience. You're reading something, it just grabs you with its truth, with its self-recognizable, self-evident truth. And his great quotations just leap out at us. They're obvious, indisputable truths. Things like, "For in religion all men are equal, as all pennies are equal, because the only value in any of them is that they bear the image of the king." The strength of Cromwell was that he cared for religion, but the strength of religion was that it did not care for Cromwell. People talk with a quite astonishing gravity about the inequality or the equality of the sexes, as if there could possibly be any inequality between a lock and a key. That is so good. Silence is the one unbearable repartee. All those great lines come from Chesterton's book on Charles Dickens, written in 1906. And when he wrote the book, he'd already established himself as a major literary figure in London. His essays had been appearing in The Speaker and the Daily News, the newspaper founded by Charles Dickens. And he already started writing for the Illustrated London News, and he just had everyone's attention. He was clearly a household name. He'd written books of poetry. He'd written a major literary criticism of Robert Browning and of the painter G.F. Watts. He'd startled the world with his first novel, The Napoleon of Notting Hill. He'd written Heretics in 1905, which of course would be the precursor to Orthodoxy a few years later. But then comes this book on Dickens in 1906, and in it, Chesterton exceeded everyone's great expectations. It was a dazzling, dazzling book, and it still is. It's on the list of those truly wonderful books that you can read again and again, and not only not get tired of it, but always find new insights and new thrills. And it's out of print. But you can read it on the internet. It's public domain, so you can print it out yourself, I guess. I have a chapter on the book in my newest book, The Complete Thinker, a chapter from which I've heavily plagiarized this talk. It's okay to plagiarize Chesterton, but it's especially okay to plagiarize yourself. So I urge you to get the book, The Complete Thinker, and it's because I don't want to haul them around New York all week, okay? Just empty that table out for me, and you'll be doing God a favor. And as far as this book on Dickens, and this is true of all of Chesterton's literary criticism, no matter what author he's writing about. It doesn't matter what you think about that author, you're still going to love Chesterton's literary criticism. But it's especially true of this book on Dickens, whether or not you like Dickens. But if you don't like Dickens, there's something clearly wrong with you, and you need help. All right. Dickens, as Lou was pointing out, wildly popular in his own time. Probably the most famous writer in the world during his lifetime. And yet, when Chesterton was writing about him in the early 20th century, he was fading from the public memory. People were already forgetting about him. How does that happen? One reason it happens is because there is this one group of people whose job it is to hand the culture from one generation to the next. That's their job. They're called teachers. And if teachers don't take the culture and pass it along to the next generation, then the culture disappears. And they just weren't teaching Chesterton, who's this guy, Dickens. They weren't teaching Dickens, so he started disappearing. And of course, the exact same thing happened with G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton stopped being taught, and we had to kind of create a revival of interest in Chesterton because the schools weren't doing it. That's what Chesterton did with Dickens. He created this popular revival with this book. It's interesting that the Academy, whose job it is to teach, instead of doing the very thing they're supposed to do, they do just the opposite. They trip over each other trying to introduce new ideas and innovation and try to be progressive, and they try to rally the young against the old. But what's interesting is that the young have a way of shocking the old, not by being rebellious, but by being reactionary and embracing the old things. Chester says something along the lines, if the fathers forget the past, it will be their sons who rise up and remind them about it. So Dickens is one of those writers who obviously should be taught in school. And of course I enjoy the fact that when people ask me, who's the writer that Chesterton was most influenced by, I love giving the answer that it was Charles Dickens, because they're just not expecting that. They're expecting there was some major religious writer. And in fact, it was Charles Dickens that gave Chesterton a philosophy of joy, and who made him look at the world with his sense of wonder, and to look at everybody with this sense of love and joy. That passage that Lou quoted, which I wasn't going to quote, so I'm glad he did, because it told you of seeing everyone as this special created character and enjoying that character, just like you enjoy the characters in Dickens. that's how God looks at each of us. Chesterton says that one of the great things about Dickens is he has enormous respect for his minor characters. And that's what God does with us. And also, Dickens has a way of truly suffering fools gladly. And Chesterton says there's an apostolic injunction that we should suffer fools gladly, but we always lay the stress on the word suffer and interpret the passage as one urging resignation. It might be better perhaps to lay stress upon the word gladly and make our familiarity with fools a delight. We can really laugh at the people that we admire, the people that we love. We can laugh at them because they know that we mean no harm, that we are actually enjoying them. It's one of the reasons we can laugh so hard at Joseph Pierce. And it's by laughing at fools, it's doing us so good to be able to enjoy them, because God gives us people who are a nuisance, not only to temper us, but to train us in certain unpleasant virtues, but especially to amuse us and entertain us. And of course, the people who best understand what it means to suffer fools gladly are husbands and wives, who have to suffer each other gladly all the time. As Chesterton says, they do it because they both know that the other is a great fool. And as he says, the husband and wife live together, they're enjoying an everlasting joke. The problem is, we don't enjoy people enough. We don't enjoy what characters they are. And we give up on people. We give up on people. We do not understand the great virtue of hope. We are like little kids. Hope is something that little kids don't get. The standard phrase is that youth is the time of hope. Chesterton says it's just the opposite. Youth is the time when every disappointment seems like it's the end of the world. The things that cause a little boy's distress are terrible, not because they're large, but because he doesn't know how small they are. Hope is a thing that actually comes with maturity. It's a thing that's nurtured by tragedy, by a variety of tragedies. Chesterton says the end of life is not tragic like the end of love. And Jesus says, blessed are they that mourn. Hope, says Chesterton, means hoping when things are hopeless, or it's no virtue at all. And we don't know how to hope. And Chesterton's book on Dickens is a book about hope. It's a lesson in encouragement. In the opening chapter, at the final conclusion of the opening chapter, he says, just as Christianity looked for the honest man inside the thief, democracy looked for the wise man inside the fool. It encouraged the fool to be wise. If democracy has disappointed you, do not think of it as a burst bubble, but at least as a broken heart, as an old love affair. Do not sneer at the time when the creed of humanity was on its honeymoon. Treat it with the dreadful reverence that is due to youth. For you, perhaps, a drearier philosophy has covered and eclipsed the earth. The fierce poet of the Middle Ages wrote, abandon hope, all ye who enter here, over the gates of the lower world. The emancipated poets of today have written it over the gates of this world. But if we are to understand the story about Charles Dickens, which follows, we must erase that apocalyptic writing, if only for 1 hour. We must recreate the faith of our fathers, if only as an artistic atmosphere. If then you are a pessimist in reading this story, forego the little pleasures of pessimism. Dream for one mad moment that the grass is green. Unlearn that sinister learning that you think so clear. Deny that deadly knowledge. that you think you know. Surrender the very flower of your culture. Give up the very jewel of your pride. Abandon hopelessness, all ye who enter here. Now that's how you write an introduction to a book. Doesn't matter which book. Now it's tempting to fall into the fallacy that the opposite of pessimism is optimism. They are kind of opposites, but neither is really connected to the virtue of hope. Chesterton says that the optimist is the man who thinks that everything is good except the pessimist, and the pessimist is the one who thinks that everything is bad except himself. And we're always tempted to associate pessimism with sorrow and optimism with joy. But as Chesterton points out, sorrow and pessimism are opposite things. Since sorrow is founded on the value of something, and pessimism on the value of nothing. So now the corollary to the conclusion that sorrow and pessimism are opposite things, that means joy and optimism are opposite things. The corollary would be that joy is founded on the appreciation of something, and optimism on the appreciation of nothing. Or at least nothing in particular. Both joy and sorrow are connected to hope. Sorrow is hope put to the test, and joy is hope fulfilled. And both pessimism and optimism avoid hope. Pessimism regards hope as impossible, and optimism regards hope as unnecessary. Pessimism is despair, and optimism is presumption. And on the eve of Chesterton's reception into the Catholic Church, he was reading the Penny Catechism, and he came across the phrase, "The two sins against hope are presumption and despair." And that was a shining moment for him when he realized that everything that he'd been doing in his entire life as a writer was fighting against the optimist and the pessimist, fighting against presumption and despair. We live in a troubled world, and despair is always knocking on our door, always peeking its frightening eyes through our windows. And the only weapon against despair is hope. But we also live in a very snide world. Presumption permeates the airwaves, and the only weapon against presumption is hope. One of the hardest things to describe is happiness. And Dickens and Chesterton are two of the few writers who can really do it. In fact, Chesterton says there are 20 minor poets who can describe fairly impressively an eternity of agony. There are very few, even of the eternal poets, who can describe 10 minutes of satisfaction. And that is the challenge. It's a challenge to write and capture joy in a work of art, in a work of literature. Chesterton says that's why so many of our hymns are bad. Because it's just so hard to capture joy. It's hard to capture the praise and thanksgiving we feel towards God in a way that really makes us feel like we're doing it. And Chesterton can do it. Charles Dickens can do it. And Chesterton saw how Charles Dickens was doing it. And that's what he brings to life in this book. And of course, the similarities between the two, it's wonderful. They're both incredibly prolific. They both began as journalists. As I said, Dickens founded the Daily News, and Chesterton wrote for the Daily News. That really established his career as a writer. Both intensely popular, and people were just hungry for their words. Chesterton points out that Dickens desired, the people's desire to read Dickens was surpassed only by Dickens' desire to write more and more and more. He was endlessly creative. And he says, Dickens was not content with being original, he had a wild wish to be true. And Dickens did not write what the people wanted, Dickens wanted what the people wanted. The other great English writer that Chesterton compares Dickens to is Shakespeare. And he says that they're both trying to express the same truths, and they do it with the same mental hospitality and thoughtless wisdom. That's a great phrase. That Dickens and Shakespeare have the same mental hospitality and thoughtless wisdom. And of course, Chesterton's the same way. Mental hospitality. So there's a welcoming atmosphere to his writing, a mental hospitality, and the wisdom just flows out of it, the thoughtless wisdom. Mental hospitality, thoughtless wisdom. Those are Chestertonian word combinations, which are always shortcuts to profound ideas. And as I said, the comparison between Dickens and Chesterton with that mental hospitality and thoughtless wisdom, because they both write books that are stimulating but also serene. Ideas that stir things up and yet settle things at the same time. And it's writing that both excites the mind and puts it at ease. Welcoming words that put the mind at rest without dulling it, and books that make us feel smart when we don't deserve it. Chesterton says of Dickens, there is a great man who makes every man feel small, but the real great man is the man who makes every man feel great. And what more could you want from a book? I know we've all heard this one. It's of course the standard question we've all been asked. What book would you want with you on a desert island, right? And Chesterton says most people answer the Bible or Shakespeare, because it would be the first time they've ever read either of those. And of course, Chesterton's great answer was Thomas's Guide to Practical Shipbuilding. But when pressed, he did give the real answer. He said the book he'd want with him on a desert island is Pickwick Papers. That was his favorite book. And it was a book that he just could keep going back to again and again. And why not? It's a book that's very funny. It has that mental hospitality and thoughtless wisdom to it, great characters, but it especially has the perfect combination of the two main characters, Pickwick himself and his companion, Sam Weller. And Sam Weller represents knowledge. He's the street smarts guy. And Pickwick represents innocence. And Chesterton says, knowledge and innocence are both excellent things, and they are both very funny. But it's right that knowledge should be the servant and innocence the master. Chesterton, he calls Dickens the great man, of course, and certainly does emulate him. But and Chesterton is himself a great man, but never would have thought he would be considered a great man. He didn't aspire to be a great man. He only aspired to really be a common man. There's this evidence that Chesterton knew there was something different about himself. And really what he wanted was to be more like Sam Weller. And of course he wouldn't have considered himself a saint either, right? And that puts him in common with every other saint. He wanted to speak the voice of the common man and offer this really street-level commentary of the world. And although he had this Sam Weller in him, he really couldn't be Sam Weller, because Sam Weller by himself is an incomplete character. He needs to have Pickwick to be complete. Pickwick may be a ridiculous character, but as Chesterton says, there's one step from the ridiculous to the sublime. And so Pickwick needs Sam Weller to be complete. And Chesterton himself really is the complete package. He is he is Pickwick and Weller both. And it's really why Joseph Pierce's biography of Chesterton has the perfect title, Wisdom and Innocence. The title is obviously taken from the two Father Brown collections, The Innocence of Father Brown and The Wisdom of Father Brown, but it epitomizes who Chesterton is. He is both wise and innocent, and that's what the world cannot stand about G.K. Chesterton. If they accept his wisdom, they want to sully it somehow by making him bad. Or if they accept his innocence, they don't allow him to be wise. They go, well, yeah, Chesterton was naive. He didn't really see things with any depth or profundity. They'll accept either the wisdom or the innocence, but they can't accept both because the world can't accept both. And that's why Chesterton continues to befuddle the critics. And there's another reason why Chesterton liked the Pickwick Papers so much. He considered it the perfect book because it doesn't end, which is another reason why you want it on a desert island with you. At the end, on the final page, you can imagine that Pickwick and Sam Weller's adventures have just begun. There's really no conclusion to it. They've formed this permanent friendship, and their adventures are just beginning. And Chesterton ends his own book on Dickens with a sort of similar perfection. Not with a conclusion, but with a doorway to eternity. This is how the book ends. We shall not be much further troubled with little artists who found Dickens too sane for their sorrows and too clean for their delights. But we have a long way to travel before we get back to what Dickens meant. And the passage is along a rambling English road, a twisting road such as Mr. Pickwick traveled. But this, at least, is part of what he meant. That comradeship and serious joy are not interludes in our travel, but rather our travels are interludes in comradeship and joy, which through God shall endure forever. The inn does not point to the road points to the inn. And all roads point at last to an ultimate inn, where we shall meet Dickens and all his characters. And when we drink again, it shall be from the great flagons in the tavern at the end of the world. That'd be a great place to end this talk, but it's about eternity, so. Let me give you a little sense of eternity now. Although Chesterton's favorite book was Pickwick, as Lou pointed out, obviously in America today, it's Christmas Carol for Americans. And it's a perpetually and perennial popular. And as Lou pointed out, it gets dragged through the most amazing versions, and yet it always works. It always works because it's a story about conversion. We love to see the conversion happen. We're always thrilled by it, no matter how badly it's depicted, the conversion still thrills us. The story of that miser who thinks that the surplus population would just do well to die. Conversion's about starting over, starting new. It's about turning back. Embracing not the new, but the old. Embracing tradition. Embracing the thing that was there. Chesterton, as Lou pointed out, praised Dickens for saving Christmas, for defending a tradition that was being lost. And he says that in fighting for Christmas, Dickens was fighting for the old European festival, pagan and Christian, for that trinity of eating, drinking, and praying, which to moderns appears irreverent, for the holy day, which is really a holiday. And the idea of saving tradition, which is what Christmas Carol is about, is the reason why it's so important and why people run to that. They like that story, even though there is this, every year, this war against Christmas. And yet that story is always there. It's always being told somewhere. The emphasis always now is on the new and improved, the desire to get new things, the breathless keeping up, the terror of being left behind. We do everything exactly backwards, exactly wrong. But as Chesterton shows, the most important thing is not getting what is new, but not losing what is old. And the most important people in our time are those who are protecting the past, because they're the ones who are going to be most appreciated in the future. And that's what Dickens did. He preserved the past. As Lou said, Dickens was preserved by Chesterton. And the work we're doing, of course, in the American Chesterton Society is to preserve Chesterton, because good things are going to happen from that. And while we all find these English things charming, just like we find Joseph Pierce charming, in the same way we find a bulldog charming, we regard Chesterton as not a quaint old English thing, but as something universal. He's especially appropriate and timely here and now. His assessment of what's wrong with the world is especially true in America today, even more so than when he wrote the book in England over 100 years ago. He wrote about truth and justice. And what words are more abused than truth and justice? But nothing endures abuse better than truth and justice. In his book on Charles Dickens, Chesterton writes, "The man who has found truth dances about like a boy who has found a shilling. He breaks into extravagances, as the Christian churches broke into gargoyles. In one sense, truth alone can be exaggerated because nothing else can stand the strain." Mental hospitality and thoughtless wisdom. We fight for truth and justice because they're beautiful things, and they're so beautiful that they make the fight itself beautiful. And Chesterton says the world can be made beautiful again by imagining it as a kind of a battlefield. He's defended the local things, which makes us want to defend the local things, even if they're not the same local things that Chesterton defended. And one of the worst things that's happening in America right now is the loss of the local things, the centralization of everything. There's a sameness that is steadily creeping over the whole country. The same ribbons of concrete crawling with the same automobiles and the same chain stores selling the same stuff and the same loudspeakers blaring the same music and the same movies with the same plots and the same amazing losses of money that those movies do. And then the same suburbs with the same houses and the same sins with the same excuses. We want to fight against all those things. We want to defend local things, but we also want to defend the universal things, the faith, the family, the fellowship of good friends who should be able to drink and smoke at the same time in the same place, and not do the drinking over here and then run over here and do the smoking. That's wrong. We want to defend a church that is not moved by the world, but moves the world. That was one of your former bishop's great lines, Bishop Fulton Sheen. We want a church that does not move with the world, but a church that moves the world. He was quoting Chesterton when he said it. A lot of those great Bishop Sheen lines were from Chesterton, but that's okay. Chesterton's timelessness, his universality, they're all epitomized in the book on Charles Dickens. Chesterton's always fresh because he talks about the things that everybody already knows. He's original because he appeals to origins, to basic beginnings, to the place where we all begin, which is a childlike wonder at the universe, and a thrill and a trust in the stories that our parents tell us. There's something else, of course, that's original that Chesterton talks about, and that's original sin. Chesterton believes in our goodness, but he also believes in our badness. And he knows that we're fallen creatures, and it's because we are fallen that we aspire to something much higher than ourselves. And it's because we are fallen that we recognize the beauty of grace and mercy. We recognize anything that is full of grace, especially when we run from it. Hidden amongst all the great lines in this book is a sparkling gem that I missed many times when I first read the book. And on one of my rereadings, it suddenly jumped out. It says, "Every train of thought may end in ecstasy, and all roads lead to Elfland." It's a rich idea, it's full of hope, a book about hope. But it's certainly suggestive because it was itself a train of thought that led to two of Chesterton's most indisputably great books, which came just 2 years later. The Man Who Was Thursday and Orthodoxy. And anyone who studied those books knows how the first book is about an unlikely path to God that comes through mysterious and unexplainable suffering. That any train of thought may end in ecstasy. And then the second book, of course, brings us directly into Elfland with the chapter, The Ethics of Elfland, which for Chesterton was the road to Christianity and eventually the road to Rome. All roads lead to Rome through Elfland. We got that Tolkien or Tolstoy fellow that backs that up too, right? The Russian writer Tolkien, yeah. I've been paying attention all day today here to these talks, and Chesterton shows that the universal truths of the fairy tale are all the basic truths that we find in Christianity. And it's interesting to see the little hints of Elfland in this book on Dickens. He says that fiction means the common things as seen by the uncommon people, but fairy tales means the uncommon things seen by the common people. In everybody, there is a certain thing that loves babies, fears death, likes sunlight. Well, that thing enjoys Dickens. And everybody does not mean uneducated crowds. Everybody means everybody. And when I say that everybody understands Dickens, I do not mean that he is suited to the untaught intelligence. I mean that he's so plain that even scholars can understand him. Dickens is close to popular religion, which is the ultimate and reliable religion. He conceives an endless joy. He's not come as a writer that his creatures may copy life and copy its narrowness. He's come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. It's absurd indeed that Christians should be called the enemies of life because they wish life to last forever. It's more absurd still to call the old comic writers dull because they wish their unchanging characters to last forever. Both popular religion with its endless joys and the old comic story with its endless jokes have faded in our time because we are too weak to desire that undying vigor. We believe that you can have too much of a good thing, which is a blasphemous belief, which at once, at one blow, wrecks all the heavens that men have hoped for. I'd like to close with a passage that none of you have heard before. It's from Chesterton's first essay on Dickens, written in 1902 in the Daily News. And we don't think of Charles Dickens as a journalist. And you know what? We don't think of G.K. Chesterton as a journalist either. But they both were primarily journalists. That was the primary way they earned their living. They wrote in the daily papers for the Daily Man. And yet they just did something much bigger than that ephemeral writing. In this essay, Chesterton says, "We know that Dickens created as life itself creates. This is the far higher sense in which great art is like life. Far higher, that is, than the ordinary sense in which the phrase is used. Great literature is like life, not because it's accurate to the leaves on the tree and the pattern on the carpet and the words that men actually employ. It is like life because it has in it the exuberant energy of life, its power of production, its sense of hope and memory, its consciousness of an almost immortal vitality. Great literature, in short, is like life because it also is living. An admirer of Dickens, therefore, ought to be ashamed of defending the great master by pretending that he did not exaggerate. He exaggerated by the same living law which makes the birds chatter in pairing time, or the kitten fight with its own tail. The passion behind all his work was joy. And the final touch of exaggeration is an absolute necessity for the great literature of joy. In his great book on Dickens, Chesterton says, Dickens is here to exaggerate life in the direction of life. The spirit he at bottom celebrates is that of through the night, but for him there are two deathless friends. They are two deathless friends talking through an endless night and pouring wine from an inexhaustible bottle. That's what the American Chesterton Society is about. It's about endless joy and trying to share that endless joy with the rest of the world. We've discovered that life is this inexpressible gift, and we're trying to get everyone to realize the gift that they've been given. And there are those who haven't figured it out, so our job is to restore Chesterton's place in literature, to point to his marvelous achievement. He gave us a literature of joy, a literature of life. The world is a very sad place right now, and it needs to discover joy. And what I'm going to do now is give you a chance to help us do that. Instead of applauding, throw money. Lou and some other helpers are going to pass out some little cards right now. And I'm going to give you a chance to make a little pledge to the American Chesterton Society. I'll tell you why right now, as they're passing out the cards, why we especially need some help. As some of you may have heard, the Bishop of Northampton, England, has just appointed a priest to begin the investigation into Chesterton's cause for sainthood. This is something we've been hoping and praying for and working for a really long time. It's a lot of work to get someone raised to the altar. It's one of the reasons why there are so few lay people who are saints. Because most saints have a religious order behind them who are doing all the work to get the church to go through its process. You first have an investigator, and then you have a postulator. And the work has to be absolutely thorough and robust. And with Chesterton, it's going to take more than one person. It's going to take a committee. And the expenses are going to be big. And there's no one right now organizing, raising the money to do it. There's no one doing it because Chesterton's a layman. And it's going to be up to us to do it. I have the great privilege of knowing who the investigator is, the priest that the bishop has appointed. And he emailed me the day of his appointment and said, Dale, I'm going to need your help. Well, I'm going to need your help. So please help any way you can. And God bless you.